Wondering who was the cruelest queen in history? Get ready to meet Ranavalona I, the ruler of Madagascar whose reign was an era of terror. Her rise to power, brutal methods and bloody legacy will leave you in awe. Subscribe and turn on the bell so you don't miss a thing. Imagine, for a moment, the sweltering heat of Madagascar in the 19th century. There, in the midst of lush and sometimes dangerous nature, stood Ranavalona I, an enigmatic figure who would defy convention and shape the destiny of an entire island. Her rise to power was not a walk in the garden, but a ruthless struggle for the throne, punctuated by palace intrigue and violence. She was a woman of indomitable character, and her rise to power ushered in an era marked by fear and oppression. Her reign, which spanned more than 3 decades, was marked by tight control and deep isolationism. Ranavalona I was deeply distrustful of foreigners, rejecting European influence that attempted to penetrate Madagascar. This attitude, combined with her steadfast adherence to the island's ancient customs and beliefs, made her a controversial figure, admired and feared in equal parts. But it was not only distrust of the foreigner that defined her legacy. Ranavalona I imposed a brutal justice system, using Tangena poison to determine guilt in trials. Thousands of people accused of treason or dissent fell victim to this practice, turning his reign into a period of constant terror for many of his subjects. Her obsession for power and the preservation of her ancestral traditions led her to commit acts that are still immeasurable today. Before Ranavalona imposed her iron will, Madagascar was a melting pot of cultures. Imagine a vibrant island, where different kingdoms vied for power, each with its own traditions and customs. Trade with other nations, though limited, flowed through the ports, bringing with it goods and new ideas. Life, though certainly not idyllic, possessed a different rhythm, one less marked by the constant fear that would come with the queen. Think of the Marina, the ethnic group to which Ranavalona belonged, but before her reign, their power was not absolute. There were other powerful kingdoms, such as Sakalava in the west, with their own governance structures and ambitions. The island was a patchwork of different groups, each with its own identity, sharing the same land but with often divided loyalties. Religion, a mixture of ancestral beliefs and nascent Christianity, shaped the lives of the people. Agriculture was fundamental, with rice as the main crop, but other plants were also grown and animals raised. Inland trade connected the different regions, facilitating the exchange of products and contact between communities. While there were conflicts between kingdoms, life also presented moments of peace, cultural interaction and social development that would contrast drastically with the coming regime of terror. But this relative peace was shattered with the death of King Ranavalona I. His reign, though marked by modernization, also sowed the seeds of discord. Leaving no clear heir, the succession became a fierce battle. You will see how Ranavalona, an ambitious and cunning woman, weaved her way through the palace intrigues, using her charm and intelligence to weave strategic alliances. Her rivals, powerful nobles and pretenders to the throne, underestimated her determination. Ranavalona did not limit himself to diplomacy. He used manipulation and intimidation to eliminate his opponents. Remember that in the court of Madagascar, loyalty was a precarious commodity and betrayal a common currency. She masterfully played that deadly game, turning her enemies into her pawns. The struggle for power was bloody. Some of her rivals were poisoned, others mysteriously disappeared, and some were publicly executed. Each death consolidated Ranavallona's power, making her an equally feared and respected figure. Her ascension to the throne was not a simple coronation, but a ruthless triumph over ambition and treachery. The succession was not peaceful. After Radama's death, several pretenders to the throne vied for power. You will see how Ranavalona, with cunning and without scruples, knew how to navigate among the palace intrigues. Her beauty and her ability to manipulate the nobles gave her an initial advantage, but she needed more than that to secure her reign. His first acts were to eliminate his most dangerous rivals. Some were exiled, others mysteriously disappeared, and others he accused of treason, ensuring that their trials were swift and final. Public execution became an efficient method of sending a message to anyone who dared to challenge his authority. The queen surrounded herself with loyal advisors, gradually eliminating those who had supported other aspirants to the throne. She imposed her will with an iron fist, establishing a regime of fear that consolidated her as the sole ruler of Madagascar. Her rise to power was a brutal lesson in politics and power. After securing her throne, Ranavalona imposed a terrifying judicial system based on Tangena, a vegetable poison. If you were accused of a crime, you were forced to drink a dose of this lethal juice. Your survival or death depended on the will of the gods, or so they said. You will see how the queen used this method to eliminate opponents and further consolidate her power. Imagine the pressure. Death awaited you if the poison killed you, but also if you refused to drink it, as this was interpreted as a confession of guilt. It was a test without escape, a macabre game where justice was decided by survival or not in the face of a lethal substance. Thousands were victims of this unfair test. Queen Ranavalona controlled the supply of antidotes, which gave her absolute power over the life and death of her subjects. Some could survive by means of an antidote, but only a select few, those with the queen's favor, of course. Thus, the Tangena became an instrument of terror, a weapon to silence any dissent. But the Tangena was not the only method of terror Ranavalona employed. His reign was characterized by fierce religious persecution. You know that Christian missionaries had arrived in Madagascar, bringing with them a new faith that directly challenged ancestral beliefs. For Ranavalona, this represented a threat to his power and to the stability of his kingdom, a kingdom built on tradition and the veneration of ancient spirits. The queen saw Christianity as a destabilizing force, a threat to the unity of the Malagasy people, and did not hesitate to use brute force to stifle any hint of conversion. Many missionaries were imprisoned, tortured, or even executed. Their churches were destroyed, their books burned, and their possessions confiscated. The propagation of Christianity became an act of rebellion, punishable by death. Imagine the pressure on the Malagasy who converted to Christianity in secret. They lived in constant fear of betrayal, knowing that the revelation of their faith could mean death for them and their families. Conversion to Christianity was an act of extreme bravery, a direct challenge to the absolute power of Queen Ranavalona. The clash between ancestral tradition and Christian faith became a struggle for survival, a struggle that deeply marked the history of Madagascar. Thus, conversion to Christianity became an act of rebellion, a direct challenge to Ranavalona's power. Imagine those first missionaries, men and women who, despite the reigning terror, dared to preach the word of God in secret, risking their lives for their faith. Their clandestine meetings, whispers in the dark, were acts of courage that contrasted with the opulence and cruelty of the royal palace. You could feel the weight of their decision, the anguish at the possibility of capture and torture. Many were captured, subjected to unimaginable tortures. Some were forced to drink the Tangena, condemned to die for their faith. Others were executed in brutal ways, their bodies thrown into mass graves. But even in the face of death, their faith remained unwavering. You could see the extreme suffering but also the strength of spirit that kept them steadfast in their beliefs. Their stories, though marked by tragedy, are also a testament to human resilience. These people, anonymous for the most part, became martyrs of the faith, symbols of the struggle against oppression and intolerance. Their courage, their perseverance, inspire respect and admiration even today. You can feel the strength of their legacy, the resonance of their sacrifices in the history of Madagascar. But faith was not the only thing that Ranavalona wanted to bend. His ambition was projected in imposing constructions, and for that he needed manpower. Think of thousands of people, torn from their lives, from their families, forced to work tirelessly on pharaonic projects that reflected his power. The construction of the Queen's Fortress, for example, became a brutal symbol of his reign. Imagine the scorching heat of the sun, the immense weight of the stones, the constant hunger and the threat of the foreman. Every brick, every stone, every drop of sweat represented the oppression of an inhuman system that swallowed lives at a relentless pace. There was no rest, only the promise of brutal punishment for those who faltered. The queen's fortress, imposing in its cruelty, stood as a monument to exploitation, a mute testimony to the suffering of thousands. Its walls, built with sweat and blood, reflected the ruthless ambition of a queen who did not hesitate to sacrifice her people to achieve her goals. The price of greatness in Madagascar was paid with life itself. From her lips, a dry and cruel order: erect a fortress, a monument to her power. Imagine thousands of men and women, under the relentless whip of the foreman, dragging huge blocks of stone under the scorching sun. Their bodies, worn out by hunger and disease, became the cement of that massive symbol of oppression. Each stone was a stifled sigh, each drop of sweat, a tear shed in silence. The fortress of Antananarivo, a labyrinth of imposing walls and soaring towers, rose in defiance of the sky. It was not just a defensive structure. It was a statement, a silent cry of power that echoed throughout Madagascar. Its construction, a testament to the terror Ranavalona inflicted on his people, but also to his regime's astonishing capacity for organization and execution. Think of the details. The dark stone, cold, almost menacing, contrasting with the vibrant color of the workers' clothes. The design itself, a blend of traditional Malagasy architecture and imposing elements that sought to mimic the power of European powers, but with a unique brutality. It was a symbol of his reign, a constant reminder of the price of disobedience. Those blocks, quarried with blood and sweat, served to erect walls, not only of stone, but also of isolation. Ranavalona I, with his iron will, closed Madagascar to the world. Foreign ships, once welcome, were now turned away, their goods confiscated, their crews imprisoned or worse. You see how barriers were erected, not only physical but also ideological, against the European influence that threatened his power. Missionaries, traders, diplomats, all were viewed with suspicion, as potential enemies seeking to undermine her reign. The queen saw in them a threat to ancestral traditions, to her absolute authority. Any attempt at foreign penetration was met with fierce resistance, an absolute rejection of Western modernity, which she considered a corruption of her kingdom. This policy of isolation, while ostensibly protecting Madagascar's sovereignty, came at a terrible price. Trade declined, technology stagnated, and the island lagged behind the rest of the world. But for Ranavalona, independence at any cost was the only option, even if it meant sacrificing his people and the future of his nation. You are witness to the relentless decision of a queen who chose self-sufficiency, even if it came at the cost of prosperity. Those walls of isolation also enclosed an economy controlled to the extreme. Imagine trade, reduced to a trickle, with foreign ships turned away from her ports. Madagascar's wealth, its precious natural resources, were now at the exclusive service of the crown. Ranavalona's control extended to every grain of rice, every piece of precious wood. Forced labor became the backbone of this oppressive economy. You will see in the pictures how the villagers, under the whip of the overseers, worked tirelessly in the sapphire mines, extracting precious stones that swelled the royal coffers. The exploitation was brutal, without rest, and the pay was survival itself. Ranavalona's control extended to all aspects of economic life. Agriculture, fishing, craftsmanship. Everything was governed by an ironclad system that benefited only the royal palace. Foreign trade, almost non-existent, left the population immersed in poverty and absolute dependence on the queen's will. That stifled economy was reflected in your daily life. Imagine the long days of forced labor, building palaces, roads, or cultivating rice under the relentless sun. Food was scarce, most subsisting on the bare minimum, and the constant threat of famine was ever present. Fear was your inseparable companion, fear of the arbitrary justice of Ranavalona. The omnipresent threat of Tangena Poison, used to settle disputes or accusations of treason, forced you to live in constant fear. Any misspoken word, any misinterpreted gesture, could mean your death. Uncertainty and paranoia had become part of your daily reality. Even religious beliefs were controlled. Christian practices were forbidden, and those who dared to practice them in secret lived in terror of denunciation and brutal repression. Life under Ranavalona was a constant struggle for survival, a game in which death could appear at any time and in any place. That scarcity, you felt it in the palace as well. The court of Ranavalona was a hotbed of intrigue, where every member of the royal family fought for his or her position. Brothers, sisters, cousins, all vied for the queen's favor, a favor that could mean wealth, power, or death. You, as a silent witness, watched as alliances formed and broke as easily as bamboo in a storm. Succession to the throne was a particularly delicate matter. Ranavalona, cold and calculating, kept her potential successors under constant pressure. Any show of weakness, any open rivalry, could be severely punished. Accusations of treason were frequent, and the Tangena Poison test a death sentence in disguise. Marriages were political tools, strategically orchestrated to consolidate power or eliminate rivals. You can imagine the forced alliances, the thwarted loves, the silent betrayals that were woven within the palace walls. The royal families were no different from any other, only their conflicts had far more serious consequences. That power struggle, I tell you, extended beyond the palace walls. Ranavalona's oppression generated deep discontent among the population. Rumors of rebellion were whispered in the shadows, in the most remote villages, where the people suffered under the yoke of his reign. Some nobles, tired of tyranny, began to conspire in secret, weaving webs of resistance to challenge the queen. But the queen was cunning. Her spies were everywhere, watching her every move. Any hint of rebellion was quickly crushed with unrelenting brutality. Punishments were exemplary, designed to spread terror and deter any further attempts to challenge her authority. Many conspirators were executed, their heads displayed as a warning. Despite the risk, resistance persisted. Some religious groups, persecuted by Ranavalona, organized armed uprisings, seeking freedom from religious and political oppression. These revolts, though often quickly crushed, demonstrated the determination of some sectors of the population to challenge the queen's iron grip. The struggle was unequal, but the hope for freedom was still alive. But who was Ranavalona really? You wonder if she was a cruel queen or a determined leader. The answer, like most things in history, is complex. Her rise to power was fraught with violence, yes, but she also demonstrated remarkable political astuteness to stay on the throne. Her steely determination to maintain Madagascar's independence in the face of European pressures defines her as a leader, even if her methods were brutally effective. For her, the survival of her kingdom and the preservation of ancestral traditions were absolute priorities, justifying, in her eyes, any sacrifice. Some see her as a defender of her culture, a woman who, despite her cruelty, protected her people from colonization. Others see her as a ruthless tyrant, responsible for the deaths of thousands. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in between, in the complex and contradictory personality of a woman who ruled a fascinating island with an iron fist. His reign, although it secured Madagascar's independence from European powers, had an immense human cost. Think of the thousands of lives lost to her brutal policies, the terror her regime sowed. The obsession to maintain control, to preserve traditions in her own way, led her to extreme measures that left a deep scar on Malagasy society. The economy suffered a severe blow. Forced labor, persecution of Christians, and constant political instability siphoned off resources and slowed development. Imagine the economic and social devastation left in its wake, a legacy that affected later generations. Mistrust of foreigners, fostered by his regime, isolated Madagascar from global progress. This isolationism, while temporarily protecting sovereignty, prevented the entry of ideas and technologies that could have boosted the nation's development. Think of the missed opportunities, the potential that went unexplored. The legacy of Ranavalona I is thus a complex tapestry of achievements and atrocities. Her iron will kept Madagascar independent, but at an unimaginable cost. Was she a great leader or a ruthless tyrant? You can come to your own conclusion, but it is undeniable that her impact on Madagascar's history continues to resonate to this day. But you may ask, how does all this brutality fit in with Malagasy culture? Ranavalona I, despite her atrocities, presented herself as the guardian of ancestral traditions. Her reign was characterized by an iron control over religious and social practices, imposing a very particular vision of culture that, in practice, served to consolidate her power and repress any opposition. For Ranavalona, the preservation of these customs was fundamental, even if it meant resorting to violence. She relied on the Ombiasi, the traditional soothsayers and priests, to legitimize her actions and maintain control over the population. These characters, often manipulated by the queen, became instruments of her terror. The Famadahana, the ceremony of exhuming and returning the dead, was a practice that, under her reign, acquired political significance. It was not only an ancestral ritual, but also a demonstration of power and loyalty to the crown. Compulsory participation in these often costly and strenuous ceremonies reinforced Ranavalona's control over his subjects. His reign, I will tell you, meant a radical change in the Malagasy social structure. The nobility, previously with some power, was subjected to his capricious will. Ranavalona I centralized power in a brutal way, creating a system of personal loyalty based on fear. The old systems of local government were dismantled, replaced by an administration controlled directly by the queen and her favorites. Imagine the life of a Malagasy peasant during her reign. Ranavalona I's policies, focused on control and exploitation, involved a relentless system of forced labor. The construction of palaces, the extraction of resources, and the maintenance of his army demanded a constant tribute of human effort and lives. The lack of freedom and the fear of arbitrary royal justice deeply marked the daily life of the population. Foreign trade was drastically reduced due to its isolationism. The once dynamic economy stagnated, leading to shortages of food and resources. Malagasy society was plunged into extreme poverty, generating a cycle of despair and violence. Families disintegrated and communities fractured under the pressure of the regime. But back to Ranavalona. His kingdom, though powerful, remained isolated from the outside world. Europeans, with their imposing ships and strange contraptions, tried to establish contact, but she received them with suspicion, rejecting their offers of trade and alliances. For Ranavalona, the purity of Malagasy traditions was paramount, and any foreign influence was seen as a threat to her authority and the identity of her people. Christian missionaries, British traders, even representatives of the French Navy, tried to approach his court. Some were greeted with cool courtesy, others with open hostility. Their attempts to influence Malagasy politics, or even to establish fair trade relations, were thwarted by Ranavalona's iron will to keep Madagascar independent and isolated. This policy of isolation, while effective in maintaining Madagascar's sovereignty for a time, came at a high cost. The lack of trade limited the island's economic development and left it vulnerable to diseases and new technologies that were already transforming the rest of the world. For Ranavalona, however, the price of independence was preferable to any concessions to foreigners. But those ships, those intruders, barely scratched the surface of the real cruelty that reigned in Madagascar. I am talking about Tangena, a vegetable poison whose use became a tool of control and terror during the reign of Ranavalona. Imagine a court where life and death were decided by a simple test, a trial through a dose of this lethal juice extracted from the fruit of the Tangenia venenifera tree. This preparation was a ritual. The bark, leaves, and fruit were pounded into a paste, which was then mixed with water. The dosage was crucial. Too little and there would be no effect. Too much and death was instantaneous. It was a macabre game where life hung by a thread that Ranavalona manipulated with cold precision. Once ingested, the Tangena caused vomiting, convulsions, and finally, death. The victim, subjected to this deadly trial, was closely observed. If he survived, he was considered innocent. If he died, well, his fate was sealed. But who decided whether the dose was sufficient or excessive? That was the real key to the power in Ranavalona's hands. Imagine the scene. A defendant, bound, forced to swallow a small amount of Tangena. His eyes, fixed on the horizon, reflect terror and uncertainty. The silence is deafening, broken only by the whispering of the spectators and the rustling of the leaves of the surrounding trees. Then the weight, an agonizing wait, where each heartbeat is a trial in itself. Life or death depends on your body's reaction to the poison. If he vomited, it was a sign of innocence. If not, slow and agonizing death came as a relentless executioner. The process, as simple as it was brutal, was repeated over and over again, turning each trial into a macabre lottery. The witnesses, with their stern looks and impassive faces, watched the terrible spectacle, immersed in an atmosphere of superstition and fear. The consequences were devastating. Families shattered, villages desolated, and a constant climate of terror that permeated every aspect of life in Madagascar. The testimonies of those who survived these trials are chilling, accounts of suffering, injustice, and death, painting a bleak picture of Ranavalona I's reign. The shadow of the Tangena stretched like a curse over the island. The silence is broken by the sound of machete blows on the sugar cane. You see a slave, thin to the bone, his dark skin marked by scars and sores. His eyes, sunken and full of sadness, look down at the ground as he toils tirelessly under the relentless Madagascar sun. The red earth sticks to his sweaty body, and every movement is a monumental effort. Their tattered clothes barely cover their bodies, offering little protection from mosquitoes and inclement weather. This is the reality for thousands of people under Ranavalona's reign. Working hours are grueling, from dawn to dusk, with no break to eat or drink. Food is scarce, often just a handful of rice and some tuber, insufficient to maintain the necessary energy. Diseases are common, lack of hygiene and malnutrition weaken their bodies, turning any injury into a mortal threat. There is no medical attention, only the indifferent silence of the queen and her guards. The night offers little respite. The slaves sleep huddled in squalid barracks, exposed to inclement weather and the constant threat of disease. Sleep is a luxury few can afford. Fatigue and fear are inseparable companions. Violence is a constant. Punishments for the slightest fault are brutal and merciless. The life of a slave under Ranavalona is a constant struggle for survival, a hell without hope. His eyes, sunken in their sockets, reflect extreme exhaustion. The work in the sapphire mines, under the whip of the overseers, has left its mark. You see how he collapses, the reddish earth stained with sweat and blood. Thousands like him, forced to till the soil, to build palaces and roads for the queen, without rest, without reward, until death. The construction of the queen's imposing palaces, a demonstration of power, stands on the bones of her subjects. Look at the roads, barely traced paths through the jungle, built with the sweat and tears of slaves. They are not engineering masterpieces, but testimonies of unparalleled brutality. The economy, weakened by the constant demand for forced labor, stagnates. Trade with the outside world declines. The island becomes more and more isolated in its own suffering. Ranavalona's ambition, his desire for greatness, manifests itself in these monumental constructions, but also in the devastation of his own kingdom. The result of his forced works is not progress, but ruin. An exhausted country, a decimated population, an economy in ruins. The price of independence, in this case, was too high. The reddish soil stained his fingers, just like the blood of so many others. Ranavalona's religious persecution was not just a matter of belief. It was a tool of control, a way to crush any opposition to his absolute reign. Imagine the terror that gripped the population with each new order, each new decree prohibiting Christian worship. Fear turned into silence, into forced acceptance, into submission to barbarism. Thousands were murdered, their bodies thrown into mass graves. Churches, once places of hope and consolation, were destroyed, turned to rubble. Faith, however, was not completely extinguished. Secretly, in the darkness of night, some continued their religious practices, risking their lives for their belief. Religious repression had devastating consequences on Malagasy society. Trust vanished, replaced by suspicion and distrust. Families were separated, communities torn apart. The social fabric unraveled, leaving behind a vacuum of fear and pain. Red soil stained your fingers, just like the blood of so many others. But religious persecution was only one facet of the terror Ranavalona unleashed on his people. For you, a Malagasy woman under his reign, life was a constant struggle for survival. Your role in society was defined by tradition, but the queen twisted it at will, imposing her cruel will. Forced labor directly affected you. From building palaces to working in the mines, your physical strength was ruthlessly exploited. No matter your age or condition, if you were able to work, you were forced to do so. The days were grueling, the food scarce, death a constant threat. Your social position depended largely on your lineage and your husband. If you were of noble birth, perhaps you had some protection, but the arbitrariness of the queen changed everything in an instant. Marriage, a traditional institution, was affected by the brutality of the regime. Widows often became victims of the violence and ancestral practices that Ranavalona held so dear. The reddish soil stained your fingers, just like the blood of so many others. But religious persecution was only one facet of the terror Ranavalona unleashed on his people. For you, Malagasy woman, the Christian faith became a refuge, a whisper of hope in the midst of oppression. The missionaries, despite the danger, kept coming, bringing with them not only the Bible, but also the possibility of a different life, a life free from the Tangena poison and the tyranny of the queen. Resistance was not limited to prayer. Many Christians took refuge in the mountains, forming small communities where they practiced their faith in secret. They organized clandestine meetings, risking their lives to share the word of God and offer mutual support. Some even joined rebel groups, fighting the Ranavalona regime from the shadows. Figures like Radama II, Ranavalona's successor, though initially weak, represented hope for the persecuted Christians. His reign, though brief, brought a respite, a period of relative religious freedom. But the seed of resistance was already sown, and the legacy of the struggle against the tyranny of Ranavalona I would continue to mark the history of Madagascar. The struggle for religious freedom and justice, despite the horrors experienced, became a beacon of hope for future generations. The reddish soil, stained with blood, clung to your fingernails. Every day was a struggle for survival. Hunger bit into your stomach, a constant ache that mingled with exhaustion from forced labor in the rice plantations or in the construction of the palaces of Ranavalona. The shadow of the Tangena, the lethal poison, loomed over you and all those around you, a constant threat that forced you to a sickly caution. Fear was your inseparable companion. A whisper, a twisted look, could be enough to be accused of treason or heresy. Informing was commonplace, and paranoia had taken hold of everyone. You slept with the uncertainty of not knowing if you would wake up the next day, under the queen's yoke or in an unmarked grave. But despite the terror, life went on. Women gathered in secret, sharing what little they had, offering comfort and support to each other. Hope, however faint, still shone in their hearts. They had to survive, for their children, for their families, for the simple possibility of a better future, a future without the omnipresent shadow of Ranavalona. Hunger gnawed at you, but Ranavalona's death came like a whisper in the breeze. A silent end for such a brutal queen. They say she fell ill, that her body, weathered by years of power and cruelty, finally gave out. Her reign, marked by blood and terror, was coming to an end. The news spread like wildfire across the savannah, carrying with it a mixture of fear and tense anticipation. The succession was a dangerous dance. His sons, raised in the shadow of his ruthless reign, clashed for the throne. Radama II, his son, ascended to power, inheriting an exhausted kingdom and a traumatized people. But his reign would be short-lived, a brief respite in the storm that had been the Ranavalona era. You, silent witness to so much horror, could only imagine what the future would hold. Ranavalona's death did not mean the end of oppression. The shadow of his reign stretched, long and dark, over Madagascar, a legacy of terror that still haunts you today in every whisper of the wind. But her story did not end with her. You, like many others, have probably heard of Ranavalona. Her figure, despite the darkness of her deeds, has captivated the imagination of writers and filmmakers. Have you wondered how she is painted? Is she a one-dimensional villain, or is there more nuance in her portrayal? In novels and movies, she is often portrayed as a ruthless, but also powerful and cunning leader. Her reign, with its complexities and contradictions, offers a fascinating canvas for creative exploration. Some works highlight her iron will to maintain Madagascar's independence from European powers, while others focus on the horror of her methods. In modern popular culture, her image is complex. Sometimes she is presented as an almost mythical figure, a powerful but cruel queen, a symbol of Malagasy resistance. At other times, her story serves as a warning about the dangers of absolute power and oppression. What are your thoughts on this? But how does Ranavalona compare to other historical figures known for their cruelty? It is easy to fall into the trap of creating a hierarchy of evil, but it is important to analyze it within its context. Her reign, marked by resistance to European colonization and fierce defense of Malagasy traditions, led her to make extreme decisions that we find horrifying today. Unlike, for example, Isabella I of Castile, whose cruelty manifested itself more in inquisition and conquest, Ranavalona's was focused on internal control and the preservation of power. It was not a matter of expanding an empire, but of maintaining independence at any cost. This difference in objectives conditions the way we understand their brutality. Comparing her to Roman empresses like Agrippina the Younger, whose palace intrigues and assassinations were sophisticated and calculated, also reveals nuances. Ranavalona's cruelty, while undeniable, often lacked that same sophistication, perhaps reflecting a system of power more directly tied to tradition and ancestral magic. In short, placing Ranavalona in the context of other cruel historical figures helps us understand the complexity of his legacy. His brutality was not simply a whim, but a consequence of his times, his beliefs and his struggle to preserve Madagascar's independence. However, that does not diminish the magnitude of his atrocities. But how is Ranavalona remembered today? After her death, the image left of her varied greatly. For some, she was a ruthless tyrant, a figure of terror who scarred Madagascar's history. Others, however, see her as a strong queen, who defended the independence of her nation against the European powers, maintaining the Malagasy tradition. It is easy to see how, depending on the point of view, such a different image is constructed. The colonial perspective, for example, painted her as savage, irrational, and even demonic. Her cruel acts were exaggerated, turning them into almost mythological legends. This served to justify the subsequent European intervention in Madagascar, presenting it as a necessity to liberate her people from a brutal ruler. But what about the Malagasy view? How do they remember their controversial queen? Over time, the figure of Ranavalona has been revised. Modern historians try to understand her reign within its historical and social context, leaving aside colonial prejudices. They seek to understand the pressures she faced, the traditions that shaped her, and the complex web of power that surrounded her. She is no longer considered simply a one-dimensional villain, but a fascinating and contradictory historical figure. Ranavalona's reign left Madagascar devastated. Think of the enormous loss of human life, a direct consequence of her brutal policies. The once thriving economy collapsed due to the forced labor system and international isolation. Many families were shattered, their members lost to purges or to diseases brought on by the grueling exploitation. Deep distrust of foreigners, fostered by Ranavalona, hindered Madagascar's development for decades. The country lagged behind in global trade, missing opportunities for economic and technological progress. That distrust remained even after his death, hindering integration with the outside world. Socially, the impact was just as devastating. Religious persecution and the indiscriminate application of the Tangena trial left deep scars on Malagasy society. The social structure was disrupted, trust between people eroded by constant fear and paranoia. Entire generations grew up under the shadow of his reign. But how do we know all this? Where do we get this detailed information about Ranavalona? The key lies in historical sources, which, although sometimes scattered and biased, paint a fairly complete picture. Imagine the diaries of European missionaries, those men and women who, despite the danger, ventured to Madagascar to try to spread their faith. Their chronicles, albeit with a Western perspective, give us valuable details about daily life, customs, and the atrocities committed under Ranavalona's reign. We also have the accounts of the few travelers and traders who managed to gain access to the island, circumventing the strict restrictions imposed by the Queen. Their testimonies, often full of astonishment and horror, describe the opulence of the royal court and, at the same time, the misery of the population subjected to its iron control. Think of the details describing, for example, the Tangena ceremony, a trial by poison that left a trail of death. In addition to eyewitness accounts, there are official Malagasy documents, although scarce, that allow us to better understand the political and administrative structure of the time. These documents, written in the local language, reveal details of the royal bureaucracy, laws and decrees that governed life in Madagascar under Ranavalona's reign. Although their interpretation requires a thorough knowledge of the history and language, they offer a valuable complementary perspective. But finding these sources is no easy task. Imagine having to search for information scattered in colonial archives, many of them in French or English, sometimes incomplete or even damaged by time. Many documents were destroyed or lost during conflicts and changes of power in Madagascar. The island's own history, with its periods of great political instability, makes it extremely difficult to reconstruct an accurate picture of Ranavalona's reign. In addition, many of the chronicles of the period were written by Europeans, and their perspectives may be skewed by culture shock and imperialist policies themselves. It is crucial to analyze these sources with a critical eye, recognizing their limitations and seeking to corroborate the information with other sources, which are often scarce and difficult to interpret. Think of the difficulty of translating records written in ancient Malagasy dialects. On the other hand, Malagasy oral culture itself, rich in stories and legends, also offers valuable clues. But these narratives are passed down from generation to generation, undergoing transformations over time. Separating legend from historical reality requires meticulous fieldwork and a deep understanding of Madagascar's culture and traditions. It is historical detective work, where each piece of information is a piece of a giant puzzle. But imagine now finding a missionary's personal diary, his words written in time-faded ink. He describes the ceremonies of the Tangena, the poison trial that Ranavalona used so often. You see his descriptions, you can almost feel the fear and uncertainty in his letters, the tension pulsing in every word. He details the process, the preparation of the plant, the forced ingestion, the agonizing wait. It is a window into the reality of that time, raw and unfiltered. Then, you come across official letters between officials of the royal court. In them, you find indirect references to the mass executions, to the public works built with slave labor, to the constant palace intrigue. Although the language is formal, between the lines you can sense the brutality of the regime. One must read between the lines, interpret the subtext. It is a historical puzzle that you must put together with patience. And finally, you find chronicles of European travelers, their testimonies often biased by the prism of their own cultures, but which nevertheless provide valuable details about daily life under the reign of Ranavalona. They describe the customs, clothing, architecture, but also the oppression, misery, and constant fear that pervaded the island. Comparing these sources is essential to obtain a more complete, albeit complex, picture. But how do modern historians view Ranavalona? Their interpretations are complex, far from the simple label of cruel. Some highlight his political skill in maintaining Madagascar's independence from European powers, an impressive achievement in a context of intense colonization. Think of the challenge this represented, the constant pressure from ambitious empires. For them, his ferocity was a survival tool, a way to consolidate their power and protect national sovereignty. Other historians, however, focus on the human cost of his reign. For them, the systematic use of Tangena, mass executions and forced labor cannot be justified, even under the prism of defending independence. They point to the immense suffering of the population, the destruction of lives and the creation of a climate of terror that marked generations. You might ask yourself, to what extent can cruelty be justified in the name of preserving a country? Ultimately, the figure of Ranavalona I is still the subject of debate. There is no single interpretation, no absolute truth. His reign is a complex web of political achievements and atrocities, of national defense and brutal repression. The analysis of modern historians invites us to deep reflection. How do we judge historical figures? Can we separate their actions from their context? And how do we balance the weight of their achievements with the magnitude of their crimes? But is Ranavalona simply a ruthless tyrant? Some historians nuance that view, highlighting her role in defending Malagasy sovereignty against European powers. For them, her iron control and measures, however extreme, were necessary to maintain the island's independence in a context of growing colonialism. Other researchers focus on the socio-cultural context of the time, arguing that violence and cruelty were, unfortunately, common in pre-colonial Malagasy society. From this perspective, Ranavalona would be a product of her time, although her reign intensified already existing practices. She is not exculpated, but understood within a specific historical framework. Finally, there are those who defend a more complex vision, recognizing the negative aspects of her reign, but also valuing her role in the consolidation of the Malagasy national identity. For them, Ranavalona, despite her actions, was a key figure in the history of Madagascar, a queen who, although with brutal methods, managed to preserve the independence of her country in the face of colonial veracity. So what's left of Ranavalona I? You decide. His reign was a whirlwind of violence, yes, but also a time of steely independence for Madagascar. Imagine the pressure he must have felt, defending his kingdom from European ambitions with such particular methods. Perhaps, from our perspective, her actions seem horrific, but you have to try to understand the context. A woman ruling in a man's world, clinging to her beliefs and traditions at a time of brutal change. Her legacy is a complex mix of admiration and horror. Some see her as a heroine, a defender of Malagasy sovereignty, while others remember her as a ruthless killer. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in between, in the grays of history. And what do you think? How would you judge a queen who protected her kingdom, but at such a high price? Her story reminds us that history is not black and white. Ranavalona I was a complex figure, a product of her time and the circumstances surrounding her. Her actions, though horrible to us, were at the time arguably calculated decisions to ensure the survival of her kingdom. And that is a lesson we must always keep in mind. Understand the context before judging. Imagine for a moment the pressure he must have felt, ruling with an iron fist over such a vast and complex island. Was his cruelty a reflection of his need to maintain control, to protect Madagascar from the European ambitions already looming on the horizon? Or was it simply the expression of a ruthless nature? Perhaps the key lies in understanding the context. A world where survival depended on force, where diplomacy was a luxury that Madagascar, in its isolation, could not afford. From that perspective, his actions, though terrible, could be interpreted as desperate measures to preserve his nation's identity and sovereignty. But does the end justify the means? The human cost of his reign was immense. Thousands of lives lost, families shattered, a nation scarred by trauma. That is a stain that no historical justification can completely erase. In the end, you decide where to place her on the spectrum. Heroine for her resilience or villain for her cruelty. But before we say goodbye, I want to thank you for having embarked on this journey through time with me. It has been a pleasure to share with you this fascinating and complex story. Remember that the past, although sometimes dark, helps us to understand the present and to build a better future. And now, let's meet the team that made this documentary possible. Behind the camera, an incredible team has worked tirelessly to bring you this story. From exhaustive research to precise editing, every detail has been carefully crafted to bring you the best possible experience. Their dedication and passion have been instrumental in bringing this narrative to life. I can't name each one individually, but their hard work and commitment to historical truth are the reason you are watching this video. From the historians and experts who advised us, to the animators and editors who shaped the story, the entire team has poured their hearts into this project. Thanks to all of them. And last but not least, thanks to you for watching this video. Your support is what motivates us to keep creating quality content. Subscribe so you don't miss future documentaries and share this video if you liked it. See you next time. I hope you found it interesting. If you liked it, like it and subscribe for more stories. What did you think about Ranavalona's story? Tell me in the comments.